Without Haji Bashar, there would have been no Taliban. Now, what I overlook is the relationship of Haji Bashar with the ISI in Pakistan.
So when America intervenes and uses Pakistan as a base, why are we not telling them that no, this is not the same? Al-Qaeda is different and the Taliban is different.
There's the Pakistani government /ISI and /military. And there is the press, the Pakistani press.
I mean, if the Taliban have surrendered in December and the war goes on for years after, what were they doing there?
You know, Afghanistan has a long history of conflict. One of their biggest CIA operations was Operation Cyclone.
Why didn't the US just comply with the Taliban and get bin Laden straight there?
Making a villain out of somebody, that is in the early stages. That also happened with Osama bin Laden. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, didn't want him. He was talking about corruption in Saudi Arabia, which is very apparent. You think, oh, the Taliban are also in that camp with Osama bin Laden planning the 9/11, because that's all what they want.
My God, it's right in the middle of the building.
The operation of 9/11 was mainly not happening in Afghanistan, right? I mean, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was out of Afghanistan. He came sometimes by car, crossed over through Quetta to see Osama bin Laden, who was living in Kandahar.
How did you find out that Mullah Omar was not in Pakistan and a $10 million bounty on his head?
Yeah.
Why did no one ever find him?
During the jihad, Mullah Omar had not lived in Pakistan.
Mullah Omar was a puppet of the Pakistan armed forces. How much of that is true? Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome to another episode of How Does It Work, a podcast by Pro Pakistani. I am very, very excited for the guest we have today. Bette Dam has written a book, as you can see over here, Looking for the Enemy, Mullah Omar and the Unknown Taliban. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us from Amsterdam.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I'm excited to talk about this. We were just talking about it off air as well. So many things I did not expect from your book. Firstly, when you assume that a Western, person has written a book on Mullah Omar and Afghanistan, especially having spent 10, 15 years there as you had, you would imagine a very negative connotation. And I wanted to start with that. Your book shows Mullah Omar is very human. Obviously, there's a lot of criticism for certain things he does, but there's also some positive feedback, some bits that were misunderstood. He isn't the villain maybe that we've been taught to believe, or the way he's been portrayed usually by media. How did you sort of come to these conclusions, and the people that you met that were close to Mullah Omar, what did they tell you about him?
Well, thank you for reading the book. Really cool. Mm-hmm. It is a different narrative. I sort of decided to write this book after being in Afghanistan for a while and observing what was going on, and mainly living in a sort of world that was not completely covered well, I thought. So I dived into that with my first book on Karzai, on Hamid Karzai, the then president. And basically it was about this big shift from the Taliban era after 9/11 to the American-supported government. The reason why I started this book is basically observing being in Kabul and other places in Afghanistan, being based there, and very quickly see that there is actually something going on that is not being captured, and that created a lot of misunderstanding about what was going on in Afghanistan, to my idea, and slowly others also picked up on that, I think. And that is that when the Americans came, there was like you've read my book, so it's super difficult to basically go and put this war narrative that was created in Washington D.C. That has a lot of points in it. For example, the relationship between Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden, the ideology of Mullah Omar, his religion, his education, his actions during the Taliban before 9/11. What do I miss? His alliances. It was all not actually what we were told, and that's not because I want to bash the Western media. I don't want to be in that court, if you know what I mean. But I do think we have a little problem with being operating from the West and flying in from afar into these countries and not taking really the time and maybe allowing the curiosity to really understand what the situation is there and let go a little bit of the ideas in the West. So I thought that with Karzai, I figured out that his government was heavily supported by the United States, and the United States was looking for an enemy. That's why I called it. It was really looking for one. At the same time, when I was hanging out with the guys from Karzai, so to say, including the president, and his men in the south, his tribal leaders, sometimes from his own tribe. So when I studied the men of like the government of Karzai, I noticed that the first thing, which was very scary to report on, was that actually the Taliban surrendered to Hamid Karzai in 2001 in December. I did not bring this as big news in my first book, which was published in around 2009, because I was just too afraid to face the backlash in the West, because the monster could not surrender. How could I even think about this? Why would I even mention it? And the American response was also like, how do you trust a surrender? It would have exploded the next way anyhow. It would have gone off the rails anyhow. And I sort of like, yeah, but then it might have gone off the rails and they might have started fighting, but then skipping the idea of that there was a will to come too close to each other and a will to basically end the war. That for me was breaking news. That was absolutely breaking news. And I still think that's the breaking news of the war. If you have to tell somebody what happened in Afghanistan, that the war was over after 9/11, the United States entered Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban regime. And then instead of what we reported always is that the Taliban was hiding in the mountains, ready to fight back the next day, and that troops were needed to clean up the situation. Instead, the Taliban went actually home or started to shop. Some went to Pakistan. And I think this is really important to start any discussion about Afghanistan, because all that happened after, for example, Americans increasing troops rapidly into a country that didn't have an enemy anymore. So then you have a fake war, if you want to use that word.
Who were they fighting? Who were they fighting at that time? I mean, you mentioned in your book that they're almost looking for a villain. If the Taliban have surrendered in December and the war goes on for years after, what were they doing there?
Exactly. So what you see is that Afghanistan has a long history of conflict, and you know that the Americans, one of their biggest CIA operations was Operation Cyclone, and that went through Pakistan, and that was against the so-called rise of communism through Afghanistan, and then the communists would take over Afghanistan, and then America said they would in the end also arrive on American soil. That was again like a huge enemy picture that was unrealistic. But anyhow, so they found the front line opened in Afghanistan, and you have, of course, because of that, you have a long history of war, of enriching each other, of the war economy, and the key players in that war, which were actually criticized by the civilians, of like, yeah, you've done a bad job in that war. We basically lost so many people. We ended that jihad in a massive civil war. We wouldn't choose you if we would be a democracy. And then after 9/11, it's the Americans and Hamid Karzai and these men again who start forming this government. And that's extremely worrying because the same men are in power again. And what happens then is that basically America tells them, we give you weapons, we give you millions of dollars and kill this Taliban. So they, in December already, they started with heavy special forces presence in Afghanistan, heavy in the sense that they are heavily armed, they're ready to kill, they don't need a lot of accountability for that. And so they went along with these men who had a questionable reputation, who were thinking first about their own clans and their own family. And so rival killings started happening, killings for land, killings for water, killings for getting more contracts from the Americans. And that was the enemy. And that created a lot of unrest among the civilians, of course, because every time in, for example, Uruzgan or Kandahar, the governor would go to his personal enemies in a certain valley and would tell the Americans, this is Taliban. Operation Medusa, for example, is a very big one in 2006, where that is here in the newspapers. You can read how successful NATO is against the Taliban, and that this operation is amazingly important and has created less and less resistance of the insurgencies against the Western ideas for Afghanistan. No, it wasn't the case. It wasn't ideological at all. It was very much the governor and the tribes in its case, in Panjwai, who were having long histories with each other. And that was, that was a main motivation. And that was increased by the landing of extra weapons and they sent a lot of extra money. You know what I mean? So you have a whole different conflict. And what was really, that's why I'm so busy now with what journalism means and what we actually have right now as the idea of journalism in the West, because we also contributed to this problem because we did report on these fights constantly as if everything was Taliban. So the Taliban was really big in our newspaper. And that, you can fill that in. If our governments in the West read that the Taliban is increasing in power, you send more troops and you send more money. And so you go in a dangerous circle. And of course the Taliban benefited from this, in 2004-05, they reorganized.
And one of the reasons you mentioned in your book that they reorganized was because they weren't as popular right before 9/11 and the people weren't happy with the Taliban, and they had a problem with bin Laden as well. So we have clubbed Al-Qaeda and Taliban together. But in this book, you show that they're very different things.
Yeah, right. That's the thing. I think as a journalist, we see it often that our governments are also propaganda machines. We don't want to see that. We always think that the government of Islamabad is lying, Kabul government is lying, Mexico government is lying. But really, our governments, despite the fact that we have a democracy, there is a lot of propaganda going on. And George Bush was the one who started this war on terror propaganda. And one of the tactics we've seen in Vietnam too, in the war on communism, is lumping enemies together and lumping different groups together in the faraway lands, because from the American perspective, the world is very far, literally, because there's a massive ocean between it. But it's really, so he tried to link Osama bin Laden to Saddam Hussein. Remember that? That was also two different people. It is something the journalists should be aware of. And I feel very disappointed that in the New York Times or AP, the distance between Osama bin Laden and how different these men were, what a different agenda. The fact that Osama bin Laden had nowhere to go after he was expelled from Saudi Arabia and after he was expelled from Sudan by Saudi Arabia and the Americans, they were chasing him. He landed because of a friendship, a local friendship in the east of Afghanistan. He landed in the east of Afghanistan. He had no idea what the Taliban was. Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden had never met. Actually, now I'm throwing it in there, the Taliban actually wanted to work with the Americans. Remember from the book? They really thought that would be better for Afghanistan and And you have to read about this if you want to know more about this. But yeah, so the Americans make this relationship very big, and then Mullah Omar becomes upset about it, and that relationship between the Mullah Omar and the United States is under pressure because of that. And I find that fascinating. Journalistically, that was fascinating to investigate, like how that interacted and how that made Osama stay in Afghanistan, because the first person who didn't want him there was Mullah Omar.
And is it also true that Mullah Omar right before this also wanted to join the United Nations? They wanted to sort of become just a part of the world, right? And even when, I think in the chapter it's called The Awkward Guest is the name of that chapter, where you talk about bin Laden entering, the first bits are all of them trying to get him to leave the Afghanistan or go to the United States. Why didn't the US just comply with the Taliban and get bin Laden straight there?
Yeah. Now, that's a very good question. I think that we need to do more journalism on that. My book was in principle about Mullah Omar, and most of the time has gone to this relationship between Osama bin Laden, because also there is a little bit. I feel that the making a villain out of somebody that is in the early stages, that also happened with Osama bin Laden. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, didn't want him. He was talking about corruption in Saudi Arabia, which is very apparent. The monarchy is corrupt, is owning land, stealing land. Osama bin Laden was against that, was speaking out about it. Anyhow, that made the relationship very difficult, and he didn't want American troops on the Saudi soil. When the Gulf War started, and thousands and thousands of American troops landed in Saudi Arabia, and so that's sort of like the idea that Osama bin Laden came from nothing and became a villain also out of nowhere. It's important to understand where he came from. And there's a couple of attacks that have been contributed to Osama bin Laden, which turned out not to be done by him. You see a push from Riyadh to link him to attacks. That's a very common thing to do in politics. That's why every attack you need to cross-check. If they say it's ISIS, if they say it's Taliban, Al-Qaeda, you need to always be aware of the very political game that is going on behind it, I think. Anyhow, so Osama bin Laden is pulled out of Riyadh. He goes to Sudan. There's nobody who wants him. The United States has then still quite a good reputation. So lots of countries comply to the request of the United States not to give a home to Osama bin Laden. And so then he lands, like I said, in Afghanistan. And the record of what he has done, like looks in the CIA papers, looks very big. He is he has a very terroristic network all over the world, but you can also see it from a different perspective. And you need to wonder, where does the CIA get the information from? Is that mainly from Riyadh? Is that mainly from the other political actor that has an interest in creating a certain image about Osama bin Laden? And this is all at play when he lands in Afghanistan, and the Americans, they meet in 1996, I believe 1995. There's already an American delegation going to Kandahar. Mullah Omar doesn't want to see him, so the governor of Kandahar meets them, because Mullah Omar didn't meet a lot of Westerners in general. And so the governor says, if you want Osama bin Laden, give us proof. And the Americans laughed that away. Like, what is this for a silly regime? Why would they don't know what justice is here. We know what justice is. We know what a court system is. And there's also the story of the other side, that the Taliban actually see themselves as the sort of king of justice, but then through the Sharia. And they really propagate this. It doesn't really work. It's still corrupt, but they do think very highly of their Islamic justice procedure. So they, many times, the Taliban response to the United States is, give me some proof on Osama bin Laden, and we'll start the court case in Kabul immediately. And that is a very interesting dynamic. There is not enough proof immediately. In the first years, the Americans also try to start a court case from American soil. Doesn't really work because there is not enough proof. And I find that fascinating. The world of terrorism exists almost always with these very thin layers of proof. There's a lot of accusations back and forth. Anyhow, in 1998, there is this terrible bombing in Africa. We know in two countries, and that is linked again to Osama bin Laden. Again, the direct linkages of Osama bin Laden to that attack are again very thin. But then Osama bin Laden, of course, becomes a bigger topic every year. And then the Americans said, you have to expel him. You have to expel him. Give it to us without justice. Just throw him out of the country. And and that goes on. And then there is no evidence. They gave some videos, some cassettes from Osama bin Laden, his speeches to Mullah Omar. And it only deteriorates the relationship between them. Do you know what I mean? I find it a bit difficult to explain because it's so sensitive.
No, that makes sense.
And
I find this really interesting because it leads me to my next question. In your book, you state that Mullah Omar had no idea that 9/11 was about to happen.
Yeah.
He wasn't in the know. He wasn't in the information. Do you think had he known that 9/11 was in the works, he would have handled the bin Laden situation a little differently?
Yeah. That's not my idea. Huh? This is from interviews with people around him. It's also, we don't know because it didn't happen. We do know a couple of things. In the summer of 2001, there is stress at the camp where Osama bin Laden lives. He lives a 20-minute drive from Mullah Omar's office. And there are three Taliban who see him. Like Mullah Mansour actually had good relationships with Osama bin Laden, for example, the one of the leaders who was killed, one of the Taliban leaders. And there is some worry. So we don't see, I don't see, but this is the first book on Mullah Omar ever. So
Yeah.
So we need more research on this. I invite everybody to follow up and to also dive into this because I do present the first layers I uncovered. So there must be much more. So we see, instead of Taliban joining what the idea probably is in the West and maybe also with you, is that you think, the Taliban are also in that camp with Osama bin Laden planning the 9/11 because that's all what they want, attack America. the ideology of the Taliban at the time is not like that. It's very much oriented towards Afghanistan. They have no international agenda at all. They have no international jihad agenda. So that doesn't happen. What does happen, on the other hand, we have a couple, ingredients, how do you say, on that story, input on that story, is that the Taliban who figured it out, they actually connect to the American embassy in Islamabad and warn them.
They warned them about 9/11. And why didn't the US take that warning?
Yeah, so the CIA head at that time I interviewed, I forgot his name right now. I quote him in my book. He says that he didn't take it serious, that it was not taken serious. He also said there was not a lot of connection between Islamabad and Washington, D.C. at that time. But sourcing from the Taliban were not really taken serious often. We know now that there were more signals about 9/11 to happen, and that the American government didn't really pay attention. It's not that hundreds of Taliban went to Islamabad. There were 2 who said, like, there's something is happening here in Kandahar. And you have to also understand that the operation of 9/11 was mainly not happening in Afghanistan, right? I mean, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was out of Afghanistan. He came sometimes by car, crossed over through Quetta to see Osama bin Laden, who was living in Kandahar. But most of the operations, most of the hijackers, none of them was actually active or Afghan to begin with, or had Afghan roots, or had anything to do with the Taliban. It was more people who had seen the training camps that were there, some of the training camps. We need a lot of more research also on what these training camps were in Afghanistan in the East, who owned them, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, or like there's a lot of more research that needs to be done. But yeah, so most of the coordination of 9/11 was not in Afghanistan, if you know what I mean. I mean, Osama bin Laden was surely there, for sure. But yeah, this is unfortunately, maybe in hindsight, I should have written a book about Osama bin Laden, right? I mean, but I
that would also be a great book, by the way. That's the next one, I think. Yeah, but the reason that Mullah Omar fascinates me, and there's a story arc in his life that we've covered in the previous podcast that you also cover a lot, is the Amirul Momineen, the religious leader, the women's rights thing, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But one of the things that fascinate me is in this part of the world, Pakistan, and in the Western world, it's almost thought to be that Mullah Omar was a puppet of the Pakistan armed forces.
Right.
That we created Mullah Omar. He was our, puppet, and we used him when we needed him. And that makes sense because he didn't come from money like bin Laden. He didn't come from power. He rose on his own. So the assumption is no one rises on their own, and they're actually completely backed by the Pakistani ISI. And they were being used for control of what we call the strategic depth of Pakistan, which is Afghanistan. How much of that is true? How much of Mullah Omar was a puppet?
Yeah, I don't know how convincing you found that chapter about 1994, when things start happening.
Yeah.
I also started from that narrative that Pakistan was heavily involved. Now, with all the time, if you investigate issues that relate to secret services, that is as a journalist, of course you can overlook things. I make that comment in my book. I might not have the full picture because it's a secret world. But I did spend quite some time on the ground with the men who were involved in the rise of the Taliban. And I sort of like unpack that master narrative of Pakistan created this. Not because I wanted to unpack it so much, but more because the interviewees that were like, I don't know, I didn't really sense a lot of immediate proof for that. So what I did find in the area where Mullah Omar was living, the jihad was over, there was civil war. He lived in the east of the west, in Sangisar, which is just not too far from Kandahar. What you see, and I described the context of what was happening, the civil war created a lot of unrest. It was unlivable in Kandahar. People were unhappy. And the first movement against that is actually coming from businessmen, big businessmen, who also involved in drug trade. That's very known at that time. On the Pakistani side, it's happening too. They have allies. Yeah. It's a massive industry. Yeah, Quetta, and then it goes to Karachi and goes all to the world. Mm-hmm. One man is important here. One who is very big in this business is Haji Bashar. And I am stating, based on what I learned, is that without Haji Bashar, there would have been no Taliban. It's this money, the man who need the roads to be open, basically. The civil war closed these roads. There were lots of issues with the roads. And they needed the business to continue. So you see that there's two other examples, I think, where businessmen try to link up locally and try to clean the area to make this happen. And the same, Haji Bashar tries the same in his area. And he says in his speeches that he cannot do it alone. The reputation of the businessmen / tribal leaders is so bad because they are also part of the infighting in the civil war, if that makes sense. So he gives the money, he gives his weapons, but he needs another face on top of this. And he says, I need to have a clean face, somebody from the moral high ground, so to say. And that's a mullah. And that's the religious leader. It's a Quran student, basically a simple man. And that was Mullah Omar. Now, it's Haji Bashar who connects to others when they actually successful in cleaning that part of the road where they live, so the trucks can drive again. That goes very, very fast, Sajan. That's really like, okay, if Panjwai can do it, then Argandap can do it, then, Shavalikot can do it, then, it was a rolling, a snowball effect. Now, what I overlook is the relationship of Haji Bashar with the ISI in Pakistan because of his business. Fair. And maybe he was sent from Islamabad. I don't have an indication. He was in jail when I was writing the book. He has just come out of the jail. And it would be amazing if he would give his account on this, I think for historic purposes, on the rise of the Taliban.
And in terms of that, one of the things I also didn't understand while I was reading your book is, so George Bush is sitting in the United States. He doesn't know anything. He assumes, okay, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, same thing. Right?
Yeah.
We are very closely linked with the Taliban, right? Whether geographically or even otherwise, we have a link to the Afghans. For many years, we fought the Soviet war with them. How can we not know the difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? So when America intervenes and uses Pakistan as a base, why are we not telling them that, no, this is not the same? Al-Qaeda is different and the Taliban is different.
Yeah. Two big players here. There's the Pakistani government / ISI and / military. And there is the press, the Pakistani press. Two institutes that can be of a function here.
Yeah.
The Pakistani government does what it wants. It is sometimes an ally of the United States. Sometimes it's not. We know after 9/11 that they decided to become sort of an ally. They got a lot of money for that. So they joined the war on terror. Correct me if I'm wrong. They started arresting people, right? They all went to Guantanamo Bay. More than half of them were not guilty of everything. Now, what I find interesting also is the press. I've studied Tolo news, for example, a little bit, because when I was operating in Afghanistan, I did not see Tolo as a journalistic ally in what I was finding out about their country. I just saw that the enemy was such a complex beast that military would not solve this, because the military basically made it worse. They gave this money and the weapons to these men with bad histories without accountability. The democracy gave the weapons, and the democracy did not ask for a cross-check on that. You know, they killed left and right in valleys. They did not cross-check if it was Taliban. It's very painful to see as somebody from that democracy. But in Kabul, the biggest CNN of Afghanistan is Tolo News, for example. And I found it super sad to see that they were not putting an effort in also standing a little bit away from that war on terror narrative. They were very much in the Kabul bubble, along with the Western journalists, to be honest. And I really am fascinated by the knowledge of Afghans and what they actually know from their own village. You know, I've been teaching in Paris 7 years, and every time I have Afghans coming to speak in my class, I give my lecture and they comment on it, and they are from many backgrounds. And always when I start talking about this idea that some Afghan leaders were using the Americans to enrich themselves, they have personal examples of that immediately. But that nuance, that essential nuance, that basically there was no ideological terrorist, but there was other groups that were fighting each other, which was very present. It was not reported. So not with the Afghan CNN, so to say. They actually had for a while a strong idea not to include the Taliban in their interviews, as if they did not exist. They really, as American government, they put them far away as a monster you don't talk to. It's a big mistake. Now, I think I don't know the Pakistani media so well. I think there is much more media in Pakistan. There is, there's also very good media, very good journalists. But I also, at the same, I think there is a sort of problem that I have been thinking since I'm doing now PhD and all of this, that is called self-orientalism. And so our newspapers, like the big ones, Washington Post, New York Times, AP, Reuters, have a lot of Orientalistic coverage. They otherize, they stereotype about Afghans in that region. They are sometimes racist. You see that the Afghan source is also lower in the article than the American source. If it's an Afghan source, it's also an elite source. That means it talks the war on terror narrative. It talks like how we talk here in the West.
Yeah.
And that is also because there is a sort of reality also in Kabul, and probably a little bit in Islamabad as well, is that we have the freedom in New York and in Amsterdam to write what we want. That's true. We do have a lot of freedom. And so we are seen as one of the better journalistic institutes that you can have in the world. We are sort of like an example. And the way we do journalism is copied all over the world. We also go as journalists, photographers, we go and fly to the other side of the world and explain our brilliant model, how to do journalism. I am a little bit more critical about this situation now after my long and very good time in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think the level of journalism in the Western world, specifically America, because they are the front runners. If CNN publishes something, everybody follows. New York Times publishes something, everybody follows. I think the way this journalist, we work, as I've tried to explain along in my book, but in other articles, in my TED Talk, is that we actually come with a very Western view on the world, American view, I would say. We fly in with a concept that we already know. Everybody was a terrorist according to us. And so we have that worldview that aligns, to my opinion, too much with what the American government has been saying about Afghanistan in 20 years. Either it was Bush or Obama, didn't matter. We sort of went along with that idea. And that is, we interview mostly officials also, mostly from the American government, even if we talk about the other side of the world. That's a couple of things that is really something we need to start thinking about. Because then, because of that, we have created this unrest, and we have not informed the Pakistani audience that Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar were not friends, that there was no ally, that there were disagreements. If I come back, I try to get back to your question, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And it does make sense. And I often wonder with history,
yes,
and in general in life, ideology, it's an ideological battle, right? So if I was to think about it this way, history is written by the winners. So if the United States bombs someone and they win the war, they write the history. And in the same way, if you look at it, you mentioned this in your book as well, the people in Kabul looked at Mullah Omar as this three-legged monster and this evil, one-eyed, horrible person because they were liberals and he was conservative. And I agree, women should go to school, but he had a different philosophy and they hated that. And then if you look at Pakistan had Musharraf. Musharraf was a liberal. He wanted a liberal Pakistan, enlightened moderation and so on. The United States is famously liberal. Even this whole concept right now of, Disney and people, having a problem with globalization is because they're trying to push their way of life on everyone and everyone's not comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. Do you think this was almost, this war on terror, if you look at Iraq, even Afghanistan, obviously, is an ideological battle, almost like the Crusades, right? So the Crusades were, if I'm Muslim and you're Muslim and they're Christian and they're Christian, so we'll fight each other. It became the liberals will attack those who were very conservative, who weren't letting girls go to school or who broke a Buddha UNESCO sort of artifact, as in anyone who was different to their way of life, they were going to attack. Would that be sort of what the war on terror was?
It was under that, like, see. There was 9/11, which was a massive event for the United States on the American soil to have such an attack. And the response to that was extremely from the liberal view. Yeah, we are the better people. That was the response. That I think Bush must have said it almost along those lines of like, we will bring freedom to the world. The way we live is the best way. And then with that intention, they added to it that the monsters were not on this. And I think he says something, the Taliban stands for everything we do not stand for, or something like that.
Yes.
And that sort of ideology, like you say, arrives in Kabul. Yeah, that is the main drive. They really feel superior towards Afghanistan. Also, I think what I try to describe in my latest book, which is the PhD, is to portray the feelings of the journalists who also arrived at the same time. Like, what did they bring for worldview? And that is also, see, I am from a very small village in the north of the Netherlands. I am raised as a non-liberal. Like, everything in my upbringing was non-liberal. I was not progressive when I became a journalist. So I was happy that I could join this enlightened world. I never thought I would. And so I joined it and I adapted. I remember I had to adapt myself and become, vote a different party, think about abortion in a different way, think about feminism was in our village a dirty word. Don't speak about it. And so I had to learn a lot. And so when I arrived in Kabul, I thought I was with the summum, the elite of the journalists. I would be with the best. That is what I wanted. That is what I really, really wanted. I have old diaries where I read this. Like, I want to be part of that. And that, I think one of the reasons why I'm writing these things is also because I feel a disappointment, because what I saw was actually not a progressive group of people. I saw a group of people that were, stuck in their thinking. They really were constantly with their head in the West. And they had no feeling with other systems of justice, with the role of women that was different to them. In a way, extremely different. I mean, it was challenging. I mean, you cannot have a more different role of the women in Afghanistan than in New York. So that is, you need to do a couple of steps to understand that. It's not to you to judge, for example. I found that fascinating, that there was a lot of judgment towards how Afghans lived. And of course, there's not one Afghan. You have the elite in Kabul, and then you have Kandahar, and you have Kunduz, and you have Herat. And
Pakistan is similar, yeah.
And so I remember one little example, if you allow me. I was in Iraq in 2003, and I was a student still, and I didn't have any infrastructure as a journalist. So I became friends with a person on the plane, and he was Dutch-speaking Iraqi, and he took me to Iraq. He took me along, and to his family and to his friends, and I went along with him. I didn't really cover. I was just curious to see, and I saw immediately that there was a lot of tribal relations. Like, his tribe, the Al-Jabouri tribe, was massive in Iraq. I noticed that. He was we sat with the mayor, and then we sat with a police commander. And I came home to my University of Amsterdam, and I tell the professor, I've seen something. And I think it's another power structure than we have here. And it's about tribes and clans. And he's like, yeah, that's the past. That's the past. Soon, Iraq will go and have a parliament. But then I started teaching at Sciences Po in Paris. And I came in because by then I had a much better understanding of how this politics, you could call it from my perspective, informal politics of families and clans and tribes and the war economy related to that. And I didn't find anything on that in Paris. And Paris is the most valued political science university in Europe and has a huge reputation. But I was, for the students, the first one to explain how important this politics was. That I also saw in Afghanistan that the parliament was actually not an institute I had to go to understand what was going on in Afghanistan. If bombs exploded, or if Taliban became bigger, or you had to be on the ground and understand what the dynamics were, who was giving them the space to become bigger, why, who was, what were the local allyships that were, that were not going through the parliament.
And
does that make
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And the problem is sort of media in a way, right? We say it's journalism, but then we don't want to. If I'm liberal, I don't want to hear the thought process of a conservative. I want my liberal, especially in the world of the internet and social media and this bipolar world of either you're conservative or you're liberal. And in that sort of same media landscape, bringing back to Mullah Omar.
Why do you not want to hear from the conservatives?
No, I don't. Not me personally. What I'm saying is generally in the world, so for example, for me, it doesn't. if someone is living a certain way, like for example, you mentioned they said that that's the ways of the past. We live in Pakistan where your next door neighbor may have a completely different worldview to you, whether it's related to religion, whether it's related to women's rights. It's very so we grew up with more nuance because we have to. We don't have the option of, in the United States it's very clear there are red states and there are blue states. Pakistan, everyone has a different opinion. When for example, even today, there's a lot of very rich, successful urban Pakistanis who support the Taliban. This is not unheard of in my country.
I find that fascinating. Yes.
Yeah. So it's not crazy to. Islam is a very big part of who we are, and so my friends and I may have completely different opinions. My business partners and I, when it comes to politics, when it comes to religion, when it comes to lots of different things, different nuances, and we're used to it. Whereas I feel in the West, it's become so much of an agenda that Disney can't make a cartoon without pushing its agenda.
Yes,
it can't just be a cartoon on Chinese person or a Pakistani person. It has to fit into the narrative of America, which is where I think a lot of this sort of was a problem. Anyways, bringing it back to Mullah Omar, another media. When I was a kid, in our media, I used to hear that Mullah Omar is being treated in Aga Khan Hospital in Karachi. Mullah Omar is in the National Hospital in Karachi. Mullah Omar is in Quetta. And then your book comes out and you completely dispute that theory of him living in Pakistan all these years, operating and running the Taliban. So can you tell us a little bit about that for our listeners who may not know?
Yeah. So when I got to know the movement by first the Karzai book, I figured out that the Taliban had surrendered. I figured that not many wanted to go to Pakistan. The idea in Washington, D.C., that was almost the same, that if you talk to Pakistan, you talk to Afghanistan and vice versa. That was not happening. There was actually a lot of distrust. Because of that distrust, especially because Musharraf was trying to arrest left and right Afghans to send them to Guantanamo Bay. Mullah Saif is the big example for this. So the automatic idea of moving there. But then there were others. There were other Taliban like Mullah Mansour, who had a good life in Karachi, the number 2 of the Taliban at the time. Big businesses, traveling around, false passports, happened. They had to stay under the radar. That was a sort of, I think, I don't know if you agree with me, Shajan, I think that for me, there's a lot of still to investigate of what this relationship really was between these individuals like Mullah Mansour, but also others who were able to live in Pakistan under a liberal government. What was the connections? Is that also tribal? Does the tribalism go into the ISI or the military? I think I don't have the answer yet.
And I think a lot of that is just we had fought so long with the Taliban and the Soviet war, etc., etc. And then there's a financial component. Let's be real, right? I mean, the elephant in the room. There is money, a lot of money in the war of terror on both sides, from the opium trade or from the obviously U.S. funding. So I mean, whichever one you want. But how did you find out that Mullah Omar was not in Pakistan? And if he wasn't in Pakistan and he was in Afghanistan and a $10 million bounty on his head, why did no one ever find him?
Yeah. So I had given up on when I described his life. I arrived, of course, at some point at the question where did he go after 9/11? We had nothing on him. There was no indication that was solid. The Aga Khan hospital did not come. I went there. I talked to people. That was the only indication the United States and the Afghan government were pushing. The Afghan government by then was heavily political. It was very much against the Taliban. It was very much, also very much having a propaganda line that Pakistan was behind everything. They were avoiding their own mistakes with their own governors, creating a lot of unrest by killing people. Anyhow, so I was in a sort of environment of like everything was focused on Pakistan, and so I tried to simply go one by every ingredient of that story. I went there. I went to the hospital. Even during the jihad, Mullah Omar had not lived in Pakistan. In the books that we read, he is living in Pakistan all the time. Yes, during jihad. He's going to yes, he's going to these madrasas. And that's a funny dynamic. Can I just say one funny detail of the Haqqani madrasa in outside of Peshawar? What is his name again? The mullah, the big mullah who's running it, who's dead now.
Anyway, I mean,
sorry. Anyhow, so that man wanted the Mullah Omar to be linked to his madrasa. He was proud of Mullah Omar, so he claimed it to the media that Mullah Omar had studied there because that made him proud. And so no, that was actually not true. I went there and I cross-checked, so the Pakistani link was thinner and thinner and thinner, and so I started asking Afghans slowly where he was. It was a very sensitive question, especially among the Taliban. I have had many interviews with Taliban who said, we want to talk about everything except for where he is. We are not going to talk about that. This is the condition. So that was tough. And in the end, I'd given up, but then there was one colleague of mine, Anand Gopal, who found an article in a local newspaper that said that the bodyguard who has always been with Mullah Omar was arrested. It was not big news. It was very small. And that made me go after him. And so I got a name, I got the date of the arrest. So I started talking with people in Zabul, like what happened here, who was arrested, who was this man, and so then it started to basically to start. I was like, the article had been out for months and months already, so the knowledge that he was arrested was widely shared. Kandahar people knew, and so it was rather easy to find him. He was, and I interviewed him for quite a long time. And like I say in the book, I cross-checked it with the leaders who lived in Zabul, who were somehow connected. Then I figured the location. I found out the location. And that was in the province of Zabul, which is the north of Kandahar. It's a long drive from Kandahar. It's a terrible road. He lived in a sort of riverbed that was dry, and in a small village with his driver. No SIM connection. He didn't see any of his family. He had two messengers. One messenger, Azizi, if I remember correctly, his name is. He's now big in the Taliban. He did not want to speak to me. I think he should be interviewed to make this narrative complete. But yeah, then I figured it out, and I figured out that his hiding place was not too far from the American base Wolverine, where Obama had sent extra troops in 2009 for the big cleaning operation, the search. So yeah, that was quite a message to bring to the West.
And I'm sure you must have got some backlash for this, because this makes the United States look quite stupid, right? At the time that your book came out, this is, I think, 2019, 2018, the Taliban were not in power.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting because the reason that this podcast is so relevant today is that they are very much back in power. They're very much trying again. So we're back to where Mullah Omar was pre 9/11, trying to connect with the UN, trying to connect with the rest of the world. And these young Taliban, this ragtag army that have taken over Afghanistan again, most of them have probably never even really met Mullah Omar.
No.
They've probably never spent time with Mullah Omar. So they know Mullah Omar through a legacy, a history, almost like a myth, like a Hercules, or like something crazy like that. So how will history not repeat itself? Because these people cannot go against what Mullah Omar stood for when it comes to women's education, wrong as it might be. But he has a philosophy, or a philosophy with other things when it comes to the drug trade or other things. How will the world now work with these young Taliban? Because I hear they're also getting a lot of lithium, which is very important to the world, and it's trillions of dollars. So they've become strategically important, but the world can't open up doors with them. So how is this going to work?
Yeah, something I find interesting what you said is that the West cannot open the doors with them, right? Because of this apartheid measure towards women. I spoke to the Americans 2 years ago in Islamabad, and I sorry for taking some time, but because this is very complex situation. I feel that that's often the case when the people of the West are working in the region itself. For example, in Islamabad or in Kabul, they have a much more nuanced opinion than Washington, D.C. They have a lot more knowledge. And what I saw after the fall in 2001, as an observer of the Taliban for 5 years at the time, I just published my book. I was really curious what would happen, and what happened is something else than what was reported. Again, not that I'm heroizing the Taliban, but what did happen is that possibly also in a surprise, because many of them did not see it coming either, the fall. That went all very fast from the Taliban side. Maybe because of a lack of coordination, maybe the Amir was also not ready. Maybe the Amir didn't have yet all his things in order. But over at least 8 months, 9 months, we did not see the girls completely erased from public space. We did not see that. They were allowed to continue their lives. There was no request to immediately cover in the burqa, for example, which was absolutely a new thing compared to Mullah Omar, which I was like, oh God, this is good news. This is good news. Like I sit here and I'm like, oh, let this be handled well. The television was not asked to stop the broadcasting. Also, the women were still on camera, which was like. Also, we didn't see massive killings. The rivalry that has been going on for so long, over 20 years, we did not see on a large scale that the Taliban entered the cities and would go door to door to kill everybody that had anything to do with the Afghan/American government. There were incidents for sure. At the same time, I must say that the coverage on this moment, this extremely sensitive moment where the country fell back into the hands of the Taliban, we did see the coverage of Americans still in that old worldview of the Taliban. They had not learned anything over the 20 years. The difference between Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and Mullah Omar, the ideas of justice, the idea that, and so we just filled it in that they would start killing left and right. They didn't do it today, but they would do it tomorrow. You know, they didn't stop Tolo today, but they would stop it tomorrow, immediately. So there was like another strict, very, very strict, judgmental narrative coming up immediately, because it's the Taliban, and that sort of simple picture was still alive. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that has not helped for the Taliban movement. That was a diverse group of people. There were fighters from the mountains, really, who had given their lives, who were extremely angry at the Americans. There's a much larger part of the Taliban right now who hate the Americans compared to before 9/11. They didn't have any experience with the Americans. So that hatred is sometimes translated in more conservatism. And like, we want to have Sharia to wipe out everything that has to do with them. But there were also others, many others, who did have other worldview, who had been around the world, who had seen other people, who wanted to have Tolo in the air, who wanted to have no killings, because So, and I think also, for example, the European Union, if you look back at their Twitter feeds, it would be interesting to pull that up. From the day one, the European is judgmental from Brussels. And don't do this, and don't do that, you know, like very much that tone that a human being doesn't like, if it's Taliban or not. And especially if you haven't done anything yet. So that relationship of like how you are covered in the West, how full of distrust, I think had an impact. And now we are in we have ended up now in 2025. It's now almost 4 years later, right? And it's gone off the rails completely, in the sense that for girls' education, it's not that the Amir has taken a direction that is trying to imitate Mullah Omar, trying to be the mysterious guy who's never, seeing anybody. Well, he had an open life in Quetta. He was a mullah there. He was meeting people. He was going to Islamabad for hospital visits. He wasn't like that. The moment he took this job, he sort of used that mystery image of Mullah Omar.
Tried to be a copy. Yeah.
Yeah. In a hope that it would also be successful. It's a different time. Also for many Taliban. Sometimes I give you the example of making a headline. Let's say we have to write an article right now about the situation of girls' education. From day one, it has been the case that actually, I would say, of the leadership of the Taliban, 80% want to have girl education yesterday. They want to have the choice. They don't want to have anybody intervene on that. There might be conservative men in Uruzgan who still don't send their girls to school. That's very likely.
Well, that's a choice. Yeah.
It's a choice. So the headline is that the majority of Afghanistan, the vast majority of Afghanistan, wants to have girls' education or the choice too. And the Amir is playing something else. The Amir is in 2025 still trying to play the 1994 role of Mullah Omar, which is hanging on to a couple of extremely conservative leaders you can easily find in Kandahar and in the outskirts, in the villages. You can find them. Also in the Pakistani border areas on your side, there's a lot of conservatism. There's a lot of conservatism towards women. I was so many times with the family in Uruzgan who didn't send the girls to school, period. It was 2007. So what he does is he's linking up with these older men. It's a small group. I believe they have the same tribal background, or they are related to the Nurzai. which is also related to the drugs business. He has his own militia right now, also not related to any government structure. He is very afraid to be killed because the enemies are left and right of him. So what is he doing there? Like, I was just in Doha, like 2 weeks ago, and speaking to the regulars. And they are like, what does the Amir want? What does he want? We are getting crazy here.
Do you think it's also a fear? I mean, is he afraid to be different to Mullah Omar because the support comes from the Taliban and the belief of Mullah Omar? Or is that just something we've been taught to believe, that the Taliban can evolve? We human beings evolve all the time. Is this just a Western propaganda that no, no Taliban wants any girl in school?
Yeah, exactly. The Taliban cannot evolve in our coverage. It doesn't know how to evolve, and that's indeed a problem. I do think that we don't know enough about the Amir Sardan. Like before, I am still the only one who've written about Mullah Omar. There has been a lot of journalists flying through Kabul. Some have lived a little bit longer. Nobody goes to Kandahar, where the center of the power is.
Why?
I don't understand.
Do you think it's they don't want to hear the narrative? I think they just don't want to hear the narrative.
I think they're not curious. I think they're not curious enough. They are not. They don't want to invest. You know, journalism right now is getting a lot of Instagram followers. You know, standing on a stage here, talking about topics you have never heard about, you have no knowledge about. It's like likes. But does the journalist give you something to the audience to actually think about, to sharpen your mind, that makes it add something to what is useful for when you have to vote in these very tense times with problematic regimes popping up left and right? Journalism is hard work. It's really hard work, and especially in war, it's not a joke. I think being in Kandahar for 1 month is not that expensive. Maybe you have to fly in and out because the Taliban has become more and more restrictive to press. But you need to, it's your job in the end. It's your job to talk around the Amir, to sit with his bodyguard who has left last month because the bodyguard's not happy. And then you talk to him and you understand that he's not happy, so he's uber critical. But you do follow up and you see another tribal leader. You know,
do you think?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. Do you think? I'm sorry, but I have to ask this. You mentioned this in your book as well, and I've met some other journalists who've been to Afghanistan as well, and they mention Kabul, and interestingly enough, they mention a party scene in Kabul. They mention alcohol and pool parties, and a lot of this is in your book, where you talk about all of these things that seems so alien. So, I mean, is it almost as if you come into this war-stricken country, you have a great time, you go to the parties and the ambassadors' houses and you have a good time, and then you write the narrative that they want you to write. So they pay you well to write, villain, terrorist, horrible Taliban, and you get paid good money, and you have a good party.
No, it's not paid. It's not cool. There's no force anywhere except the worldview of the editor in New York. This book I'm writing right now, you can see that if there is good-willing journalists in Kabul who try to say, actually, we don't know who's behind this attack, and I'm not going to jump on the terrorism narrative because it's dangerous. Before we know, McCain is sending more troops to this country. I have, for example, with the Wall Street Journal, I have been interviewed a couple of times about issues recently in Afghanistan. I explain that, for example, that the Taliban, the Mullah Omar and Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have a difficult relationship. And that actually there was an attempt to set him out of the country, which we spoke about. The next day I wake up, I open the newspaper, it's out of the article. It's cut out.
Why?
There's no space enough. Yeah, there's no space enough. Of course there's no space enough. When the Wall Street Journal earlier, and I love the journalist really, but she is part of a system. Earlier, we went to Zabul together because the Wall Street Journal, and I was happy with that, wrote a whole article about me finding Mullah Omar, his hiding place. And I said, please include the surrender, because it's important to understand the Taliban in 2001 wanting to come close to the Americans and Karzai. That is very important to know about this movement. There was no space. It was cut out. And its priorities, it is priorities. What do you want to tell your reader? And it's safe. It's safe. It gives you access to the powerful sources, the relationship between Washington, D.C., the correspondence there. I know how that works. You need access. You don't want to ruin the access. And saying that the enemy actually surrendered is difficult. So that system is not creating the best journalism right now. And there's many inside that system who want this different. My colleague who wrote about me and my friend, she also wants it different. So we need to have this discussion, I think, because Afghanistan is an extremely good example of how things went wrong. And why don't they go? And that's why one reason the editor will not send the journalist to Kandahar for a month. The editor finds it difficult, dangerous, expensive, have never been there, that sort of stuff.
So,
and also
America,
there is Sorry, and also there's when I started doing the Mullah Omar book, everybody was saying, "Don't do it, you will die, And I had already been in the areas where his history was. I've passed it. I've seen his home where he was living as a student, So I had already a much more idea of what the possibilities were. But from Kabul, that was difficult to understand. Yeah.
And I can understand the United States agenda or even their narrative to some extent. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal, or you mentioned people, even in Kabul, they have an agenda. The thing I have never been able to understand is, so Pakistan helps the Taliban rise. They see them rise. They work with them. We misunderstand them the first time. And we think Mullah Omar will listen to us. He doesn't listen to us. The United States come, whatever happens, war on terror. Now the Taliban come back into power. The easiest thing for Pakistan in this point should be able to mend those bridges. We go back and are still, not just at the time that the Taliban took over, but till today, trying to strong arm the Taliban into listening to what we want. Yeah. We are a country with our own Taliban. The Tehreek-e-Taliban are a part of Pakistan. They are doing terrorist attacks within Pakistan. Yet, how is it possible that Pakistan has spent 50 years with these people and we know nothing about them? We still think we can show up like America and, wave our big gun and be like, listen, sit down and do what we say.
Yeah.
It just seems to be like history with the Taliban that happened in 94 is repeating itself in 2025 and nothing is changing. Everyone is sticking to their principles and they're saying that this is how it is. Now, what I worry for as Pakistan is when you keep, a lot of these Taliban have now married Pakistani women or vice versa, and they've become a part of our societies where one part of Pakistan is closer to Afghanistan, as in the KP side, in values and systems than it is maybe to Punjab.
Yeah.
What happens with us? Like, what do you think? I mean, because the country will eventually start to become divided, almost like Afghanistan post that Soviet Union war.
You mean what happened to Pakistan?
Yeah, what do you think Pakistan should do, or what is Pakistan doing wrong?
Okay. I'm with you. I didn't know Pakistan that well, really. But I lived in Pakistan for a little bit in 2003, and I was hanging out with elite, like also finance former finance ministers, special representatives who had been working in Afghanistan. And I was absolutely stunned by the lack of knowledge of them. It's a very elite group of people that are the powerful. That also really made me think about Islamabad on the one hand, there's the, the lack of, there's indeed that sort of lack of knowledge, and there's an absolute arrogance to look down on the Taliban. They are just this little mullahs. You laugh about them indeed. But of course, there's much more knowledge in other parts of Pakistan, like in the Baluch area, in Quetta. There's a journalist coming or two from these tribal areas. If they are talking privately to you, they can explain how the situation works, how power works, and how they operate, and how they are actually human beings, just like and how that they have quite some influence. I don't know what to say for the rest. I was surprised by that, and I think. What would you think? Like I think that it is absolutely silly to see how the conflict goes on between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It is really sometimes childish, honestly, if I see it. And the knowledge is present in Pakistan. There is no question about it. Like you say, there's big businessmen who support the Taliban, who know exactly how they think. That is present. At the same time, I think the Pakistani Taliban in the tribal areas on your side, the TTP, and the Afghan Taliban have a lot of difference too. They are now finding each other maybe across the border to host and to attack. We need to really look into that. There is the media in Pakistan and some think tanks are framing this also as terrorism. I think there's much more under it. There's lots of conglomerations of tribes and stuff that have another interest in attacking each other. But I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. My main worry is the biggest question for me is to see if there is any possibility that the girls' education, that the role of women can be how the majority of the Afghans want it to be. I don't know. That's an easy answer, maybe, but that.
Can you see that happening? Can you almost see the Taliban becoming more liberal?
I wouldn't use the word liberal in this case with the Taliban, because then it's over. But I do see, open-minded. Like maybe it feels to me that Amir and his crew, so to say, his clique in Kandahar, is very far from any change of mind. But I also know that there's a lot of Taliban who are sending him letters, trying to meet him. Businessmen do the same, who want girls' education. Now, I haven't been in Kandahar, so I'm also a little bit handicapped in this case. But I was in Doha, and I spoke to interesting people who just came from Afghanistan, who are entrepreneurs there. And I came across an example of what happened also before 9/11, which was that the girls' education, since the Amir blocks it from his sort of like high-level position, there is underground, there are people trying to make things happen. And one of the ways to make things happen is to connect to the madrasas and try to diversify the curriculum. You know what I mean? So you learn Farsi, you learn Pashto, you learn other mathematics, for example, to add that to the madrasa system. And I was talking to a couple who told me that this program was actually successful. and who told me, and it was really a flash from the past, that the Taliban also appreciated this move to go and make the curriculum more diverse. It made me think of this German guy I quote in my book, who also did the same before 9/11, and who also connected with a lot of madrasas in Kabul and Logar to diversify the curriculum. And in both cases, it's stranded. There needs to be other ways of financing. There needs to be other ways of money, because UNICEF, for example, does not have if I understand well, does not have the mandate to support religious education. So there is, on that front, there is a will to expand, to go through the religious education and make it more diverse. But in both cases, that didn't happen. Now, there's a lot of people who say, do not enrich the madrasas, because then you will never get the real education back, or real education like the less religious education. But this is something I saw, and I do think, yeah, go on.
Yeah, to each their own, right? I mean, if you can sort of, if we're supposed to look at the world open-mindedly, if they want to teach via madrasas in a different way, and that's a way of education for girls, it shouldn't matter how they're educated or what. It should just matter that they get the baseline education that they deserve.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. The Taliban are I found it interesting to hear this. I mean, of course, there needs to be, I think, and ideally there would be the choice of the family, of course, to decide what sort of education they want. And yeah, that's not happening. And I think from political science perspective, I think the question of like how to, and it's the same with Mullah Omar now, like how to bring a trust between these foreign powers and this really center of power in Kandahar is really, really important question, and it might need out of the box thinking. It might need different ways of diplomacy we have never thought about before. Like sometimes, because I saw all these Westerners coming in, I sometimes wondered, like, can we not have like one sort of committee of experts, people who really know the country, and they are the first institute to talk to, and then the diplomats can talk to them. But the lack of knowledge is so hurtful, or the lack of also the lack of daring to know, to bring up sensitive issues that go against the war on terror narrative, and that's also for the diplomat very difficult to do. So there's a lot of hot air basically in these conversations.
I have sort of one final question for you. Do you think, obviously this is a hypothetical question, but when you wrote this book, do you think, had you written it to the more United States agenda and shown Mullah Omar as that, one-eyed monster, horrible person, that maybe would this book have sold more copies? Would it have gotten more traction? Is it sometimes that almost people don't want to hear the nuance? They want their narrative.
Oh yeah. That you see that a lot, and you see that a lot in journalism too. Not so long ago, a friend of mine wrote a book who was very close to me, and we had a very beautiful life in Kabul, like I described. Because the security narrative is also something that I question a little bit, but read my book for that. And so he made the life we shared in Kabul look suddenly extremely dangerous in the book. We were living not too far from the United States Embassy, so we could hear when it was attacked. And I'm like, that never crossed our mind when we lived there. We were actually the ones that were critical towards this constant security, constant having bodyguards, barbed wire around your house. You know, that was that was almost a fabrication from America. So yes, journalists do that all the time. I lived for 1,000 days in the most dangerous part of the world. Oh my God, give me a break. We had the most fun life for many, many years. So yes, the book I could have been much more successful. Like one film producer who considered making a film about my book really took a month to read it and then invited me and said, I have a very, very difficult question for you. This book is about how possible and rather easy it was to get certain cross checks, to do certain parts, to do in journalism in Afghanistan. And he's like, can we just not, like, if the film ends, can you just not die because the Taliban has killed you? just
that
let
would
it end.
sell better, right? That's the better story. Yeah. And that's the sad reality. Yeah. Anyways, thank you so much. This was really, really insightful.
Thank you.
There's a lot to learn here.
Yeah. Thank you for the lovely conversation, really.
Thank you. And thank you guys for watching. If you haven't read Bette's book, I would suggest you get it. It's available in bookstores across Pakistan. And if you like our content, please do subscribe to our channel, and we will see you for the next podcast.